August 25th, 1944. A German reconnaissance officer crouched in the ruins of a farmhouse near Chartres, France, and stared through his field glasses at what should have been impossible. The Americans had run out of fuel 3 days ago. Intelligence reports confirmed it. Patton's Third Army sat motionless across the French countryside, hundreds of Sherman tanks silent, useless, their crews rationing cigarettes and waiting for gasoline that would never come. Except it was coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The officer watched a convoy of trucks stretch along the horizon, headlights blazing even in daylight, moving at impossible speed for military transport. 50 vehicles, then 100, then he stopped counting. They moved in perfect formation, each marked with a red circle painted on hood and canvas, and they did not stop, not for air raid warnings, not for fuel, not for darkness. Behind them came another convoy, and another. The road became a river of steel flowing east. He lowered his binoculars and reached for the field telephone. When the operator connected him to division headquarters, the officer spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "The Americans have created something we did not anticipate," he said. "They are supplying an entire army through truck convoys alone, without railroads, without ports nearby. I believe they intend to drive these vehicles day and night until they reach Berlin." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a single question. "How many trucks?" The officer looked back at the endless columns snaking across the French countryside. "Thousands," he said. "Perhaps 6,000, perhaps more." He paused. "Sir, we were wrong about their logistics. We were very, very wrong." The story of how American logistics shattered German calculations begins not with a triumph, but with a crisis. On August 20th, 1944, General George Patton's Third Army had advanced so rapidly across France that it had outrun its own supply system. His tanks consumed 200 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. His trucks, another 50. Every day, the Third Army alone burned through over 1.5 million liters of gasoline. The problem was simple and catastrophic. All Allied supplies still came through the Normandy beaches, now over 300 kilometers behind the front lines. The Germans had destroyed France's railroad system in the weeks before D-Day to prevent their own reinforcements from reaching the coast. That same demolished infrastructure now prevented the Allies from supplying their armies. The major channel ports, Le Havre, Calais, Antwerp, remained in German hands. On August 22nd, Patton received the order he had been dreading. "Stop. Halt the advance. Fuel is exhausted." His response was characteristic. "My men can eat their belts," he radioed back, "but my tanks cannot run on patriotism." Yet even Patton's legendary stubbornness could not change mathematics. Without fuel, the greatest armored advance in history would simply end. The Germans would regroup. The war would drag on through another winter, perhaps another year. At Supreme Allied headquarters in Versailles, General Dwight Eisenhower confronted a strategic nightmare. His armies had broken through in Normandy, liberated Paris, driven the Germans back toward their own border. Victory seemed within reach. But now, at the moment of triumph, the advance was grinding to a halt, not from enemy resistance, but from the tyranny of distance and the brutal arithmetic of supply. A typical American infantry division required 700 tons of supplies per day. An armored division needed 800. By late August, there were 28 Allied divisions advancing across France. The mathematics were staggering. 20,000 tons of supplies every single day moved from Normandy beaches to armies now scattered from Brittany to the German border. The Allied command had anticipated this problem. Of course, they had planned for it. But their plans assumed a slower advance, time to capture ports, opportunity to repair railways. Patton and the other commanders had moved too fast, won too decisively. They had created a crisis of success. On August 25th, in a conference room at Versailles, American logistics officers presented a solution that seemed to border on madness. They would create a dedicated truck route, closed to all other traffic, operating 24 hours per day without pause. thousands of trucks moving in continuous convoys from Normandy to the front. No stops except for fuel and mechanical repairs. Drivers would be ordered to maintain maximum speed regardless of conditions. The operation would be named Red Ball Express, borrowing railroad terminology for high-priority freight. The plan immediately drew skepticism. French roads were built for civilian traffic, not military convoys running day and night at wartime speed. There were not enough trucks. There were not enough drivers. The trucks that existed were already worn from 2 months of continuous operations since D-Day. Maintenance facilities did not exist along the proposed routes. German aircraft, though diminished, still conducted raids. Saboteurs operated behind Allied lines. But the alternative was unacceptable. Without this emergency supply system, the offensive would stop. The Germans would have time to establish new defensive lines. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 would be lost. Eisenhower approved the plan. He assigned Brigadier General Ewart Planck to command the operation. Planck, known throughout the army as Little Patton for his aggressive style, was given 48 hours to make the impossible function. His first words after receiving the assignment became legendary among logistics officers. Let it never be said that lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans couldn't. The scramble to assemble the Red Ball Express revealed just how unprepared the Allies were for such an operation. The US Army had trucks, thousands of them, scattered across France, but they belonged to different units with different missions. Pulling them together meant stripping combat divisions of their organic transport. It meant requisitioning vehicles from engineering battalions, medical units, even military police. The truck that would become the backbone of the Red Ball Express was the GMC CCKW, known universally as the Jimmy, or Deuce and a Half, a 6-wheel drive truck. Rated to carry 2.5 tons of cargo, the Jimmy had been in production since 1941. By August 1944, General Motors had built over 500,000 of them. They were designed for reliability rather than elegance. A 6-cylinder engine producing 91 horsepower, a 4-speed manual transmission, 6 wheels, all driven. Top speed of 72 kilometers per hour on paved roads, slower on dirt. The Jimmy was not particularly sophisticated, but it had one quality that mattered above all others. It kept running. Mechanics could swap an engine in 2 hours, tires could be changed in minutes, the truck could operate in mud, sand, snow, or dust. It could ford streams, it could traverse terrain that would disable more refined vehicles. Most importantly, it was simple enough that drivers with minimal training could operate and, if necessary, repair it. By August 27th, Planck's logistics officers had assembled 67 truck companies, 3,358 vehicles, for the first convoys. The route was established. Trucks would depart from Cherbourg and Utah Beach, drive southeast to Chartres, unload, and immediately return by a different road. 2 one-way highways, one going forward with supplies, one returning with empty trucks. Round-trip distance, approximately 250 kilometers. The next challenge was finding drivers. The Red Ball Express would require not hundreds, but thousands of men capable of driving heavy trucks under combat conditions. Many would need to be trained from scratch. The Army issued an urgent call for volunteers from all units in France. Priority was given to men with any civilian driving experience. But the need was so desperate that many drivers received only 3 weeks of instruction before being assigned to a convoy. The majority of men who answered this call were African-American soldiers. In 1944, the U.S. Army remained strictly segregated. Black troops were assigned primarily to supply and construction units rather than combat roles. This policy, born of racism and the false belief that African Americans lacked the capability for frontline service, meant that most truck companies were already predominantly or entirely black. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers would be African American. They came from every corner of the United States. Factory workers from Detroit, farmers from Mississippi, teachers from Chicago, railroad men from Texas. Many had never driven a truck before the army taught them. Some had never driven any vehicle. They were about to become essential to Allied victory in a way that no one, least of all the German command, had anticipated. The German General Staff had spent years studying American industrial capacity. They knew the United States could produce trucks, tanks, aircraft in quantities Germany could never match. But German military doctrine, shaped by decades of European warfare, assumed that industrial capacity alone could not overcome the fundamental problems of military logistics. Logistics, in the German view, was a science with iron laws. Armies required railroads to move supplies in bulk. Trucks could supplement rail transport but never replace it. Ports were essential. Supply depots had to be established and stocked. These things took time, required infrastructure, imposed natural limits on how fast any army could advance. The Germans had experienced this reality themselves in Russia. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, had demonstrated that even the Wehrmacht, with its vaunted logistical efficiency, could not maintain offensive operations when supply lines stretched beyond railroad capacity. German armies had advanced deep into Russia, then ground to a halt as trucks broke down, fuel ran short, and the primitive Soviet road network dissolved into mud. If the mighty Wehrmacht, with its experience and organization, could not overcome these logistical barriers, how could the Americans? The U.S. Army was enormous, yes, but it was also untested, its soldiers soft, its officers inexperienced. Americans excelled at production, at building things in factories far from combat, but war required more than production. It required the ability to move supplies under fire, to maintain equipment in terrible conditions, to push men and machines beyond their rated limits day after day. German intelligence officers in France had noted with satisfaction the Allied slowdown in late August. The reports confirmed what doctrine predicted. The Americans had advanced too fast. Now they were paying the price. Their tanks sat motionless. Their infantry consolidated positions rather than attacking. This was natural, the inevitable consequence of overextended supply lines. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, received regular intelligence summaries on Allied logistics. The reports in late August made encouraging reading. The Americans had fuel for perhaps 3 more days of operations. After that, their advance would halt. The Germans would have time to establish new defensive positions along more favorable terrain. Perhaps they could even launch limited counterattacks, exploit the American vulnerability. August 26th, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photographed unusual activity on French roads leading east from Normandy. The analyst who examined the photographs noted large convoys of trucks moving in organized columns. This was not surprising. The Americans always had trucks, but the scale seemed excessive. The analyst drafted a report noting the increased vehicle traffic, but assessed it as routine supply operations. That same day, a German signals intelligence unit intercepted American radio traffic referring to something called Red Ball. The name meant nothing to German intelligence. It did not appear in their extensive files on U.S. Army units and operations. A junior intelligence officer suggested it might be a code name for a new offensive. A senior officer disagreed. The radio traffic seemed to concern logistics, not combat operations. It was filed and forgotten. On August 27th, the first Red Ball convoys departed from Cherbourg. 67 truck companies, over 3,000 vehicles, began moving south and east. The scale was unprecedented, but the Germans still did not understand what they were seeing. Individual reconnaissance reports noted heavy truck traffic, but these reports did not reach the officers capable of grasping their significance until it was too late. The convoys moved faster than German intelligence anticipated. Truck columns that should have taken 8 to 10 hours to reach their destinations were arriving in 6. The trucks did not stop to rest. They did not pause for meals. They simply drove, delivered their loads, and immediately turned around to collect more supplies. On August 29th, just 4 days into the operation, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies in a single day. Patton's tanks, which had been motionless on August 24th, roared back to life. The Third Army resumed its advance. German defensive positions that might have been fortified were overrun before construction could be completed. At Wehrmacht headquarters, confusion reigned. How were the Americans resupplying their armies? Aerial reconnaissance showed no major railroad reconstruction. The ports remained damaged or in German hands. Yet, somehow, the Allied offensive was accelerating rather than stopping. The fuel that should have run out was arriving. The ammunition that should have been exhausted was still being fired. A German logistics officer named Colonel Hans Müller reviewed intelligence reports and reached a conclusion that his superiors initially refused to believe. The Americans, he reported, had created a truck-based supply system of unprecedented scale. They were operating perhaps 6,000 vehicles in continuous rotation, moving supplies, day and night, without pause. It was, Müller wrote, logistically inefficient by every standard measure. The trucks consumed fuel themselves. The drivers would inevitably exhaust themselves. The vehicles would break down from overuse. Yet, somehow, impossibly, it was working. Müller's report reached Field Marshal von Rundstedt on September 1st. Von Rundstedt read it twice, then summoned his chief logistics officer. "Is this possible?" he asked. "Can the Americans actually supply their armies primarily by truck convoy?" The logistics officer hesitated. "In theory, no, Herr Field Marshal. The fuel consumed by the trucks themselves would make such an operation unsustainable. The maintenance requirements would be prohibitive. But," he gestured at the intelligence reports, "the evidence suggests they are doing exactly that." Von Rundstedt stared at the map of France. Red pins marked known German positions. Blue pins showed Allied advances. The blue pins had been motionless for 3 days. Now they were moving again, pushing steadily east. "What does this mean for our defensive preparations?" "It means," the logistics officer said slowly, "that we cannot count on time. We cannot assume the Americans will pause to consolidate their supply lines. They have found a way to avoid that pause. If they can sustain this operation, they can continue advancing until they reach the German border." Von Rundstedt dismissed the officer and sat alone with the reports. The numbers were staggering. 12,000 tons per day, over 3,000 vehicles in constant motion. And if the initial reports were correct, the Americans were still expanding the operation, adding more trucks, extending the routes further east as their armies advanced. The Field Marshal had fought in 2 world wars. He had studied logistics at the German War Academy. He had commanded armies across Europe, and he had never seen anything like this. The Americans were not following the rules. They were not respecting the limitations that constrained rational military planning. They were simply throwing trucks and drivers and fuel at the problem until it was solved through brute force. It was, von Rundstedt thought, the most American solution imaginable, wasteful, inelegant, contemptuous of established military science, and undeniably, terrifyingly effective. The supreme irony would not become clear until years after the war, when military historians began analyzing the Red Ball Express in detail. The operation that German generals had considered impossible, that violated every principle of efficient logistics, that seemed to confirm every stereotype about American military amateurism, had in fact changed the nature of modern warfare forever. But in early September 1944, that understanding lay in the future. For now, German officers simply watched in growing dismay as their assumptions about American capabilities proved catastrophically wrong. The Americans who were supposed to halt for supplies were not halting. The offensive that was supposed to run out of fuel was accelerating, and thousands of trucks marked with red circles continued to flow across France, carrying the material that would destroy the Third Reich. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Private Robert Matthews of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company had never driven anything larger than his father's pickup truck before the army. Now, on September 1st, 1944, he sat behind the wheel of a GMC Jimmy loaded with 5 tons of ammunition, racing through the French countryside at 60 kilometers per hour in total darkness. The official speed limit was 40 kilometers per hour. The official policy was to maintain 40 meters between vehicles. The official rule was to drive with headlights on for safety. Matthews, like most Red Bull drivers, ignored all 3 regulations. He had disabled his truck's governor, the device that limited top speed to 90 kilometers per hour. He drove within 20 meters of the truck ahead, close enough to see its blackout lights, but no closer. And he kept his own headlights off, driving by moonlight and instinct through a landscape where German stragglers still operated. Matthews had been on the Red Ball for 6 days. In that time, he had driven over 2,000 kilometers. He had slept perhaps 15 hours total, grabbing rest in the cab while his partner drove, jolting awake at every pothole. His hands had permanent blisters from gripping the steering wheel. His eyes burned from staring into darkness hour after hour. His back ached from the truck's primitive suspension, transferring every bump in the road directly to his spine. But Matthews kept driving because he understood what the officers never quite said directly. Every liter of fuel he delivered meant American tanks could advance another few kilometers. Every crate of ammunition he hauled meant American artillery could fire another barrage. Every hour he delayed might mean American soldiers died waiting for supplies that never came. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The reality of the Red Ball Express bore little resemblance to the neat organizational charts created at headquarters. On paper, the system was elegant. Trucks departed Cherbourg loaded with supplies, drove to Chartres, unloaded, and returned via a different route. Each truck made the round trip in approximately 54 hours. 2 drivers per truck allowed continuous movement with minimal stops. Military police controlled intersections to ensure smooth traffic flow. In practice, the Red Ball was barely controlled chaos held together by the determination of exhausted men. Trucks departed whenever they were loaded rather than waiting for proper convoys to form. Drivers pushed their vehicles far beyond rated speeds because getting supplies to the front mattered more than following regulations. Maintenance that should have taken hours was conducted in minutes because there was no time for anything more. The trucks themselves were being destroyed by the pace. The GMC Jimmy was designed for reliability, but no vehicle could withstand the treatment Red Bull drivers inflicted. Transmissions overheated from constant high-speed driving. Brakes wore out in days rather than months. Tires, already in short supply, burst under the combination of overloading, high speeds, and terrible roads. Engines, pushed to maximum output hour after hour, consumed oil at alarming rates and developed problems that would have required complete overhauls in peacetime. Maintenance crews worked miracles. A team of 4 mechanics could swap an engine in 2 hours when the manual said it should take a full day. Tire changes that normally required 20 minutes were completed in 5. When a truck broke down on the road, mechanics arrived within minutes, assessed whether it could be repaired quickly, and either fixed it or pushed it off the road to clear the way for following traffic. The discarded trucks lined the Red Ball routes like metal corpses. Vehicles that could not be repaired immediately were simply abandoned where they stopped. Their cargo was transferred to other trucks. Their drivers were reassigned. The wrecks accumulated along French roads, testimony to the brutal calculus of the operation. A broken truck was expendable. The supplies it carried were not. Private James Thompson of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company experienced the thin line between life and death that Red Bull drivers walked daily. On September 7th, driving through darkness near Chartres, Thompson heard a sound he had been dreading for weeks. The sharp crack of a rifle shot, very close. His windshield starred but did not shatter. He accelerated instinctively, pushing the Jimmy to its maximum speed. Behind him, his assistant driver, Private Charles Wilson, grabbed the Thompson submachine gun mounted in the cab and fired blindly into the darkness on their left. Neither man knew if they hit anything. They simply drove and shot until the road curved and they were past whatever sniper had targeted them. Thompson reached the supply depot 15 minutes later. Only then did he realize how close the bullet had come. The round had passed through the windshield just above the steering wheel, missing his head by perhaps 10 centimeters, and exited through the canvas top. If he had been sitting slightly higher in his seat, if the road had been smoother so he was not bouncing, if the sniper's aim had been marginally better, Thompson would have died without even knowing what killed him. Wilson climbed out of the cab, shaking. "We should report this," he said. "Get them to send patrols to clear that stretch of road." Thompson shook his head. "Report what?" "We were somewhere between Chartres and Alençon. That's 30 kilometers of road. Could have been anywhere along it. By the time anyone gets there, he'll be gone." He looked at the starred windshield. "We just keep driving. That's all we can do." The German Luftwaffe, though greatly reduced from its strength earlier in the war, still posed a threat. Red Ball convoys were ideal targets, hundreds of vehicles, often traveling in daylight, moving at predictable speeds along known routes. A successful attack could destroy dozens of trucks and disrupt supply for days. But by September 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer had the aircraft or fuel for sustained operations against ground targets in France. The few attacks that did occur were terrifying, but ultimately ineffective. German pilots would appear suddenly, strafe a convoy, and disappear before American fighters could intercept. Drivers learned to watch the sky constantly and dive for ditches at the first sound of aircraft engines. Sergeant William Davis of the 3rd Quartermaster Company experienced one of these attacks on September 12th near Dreux. His convoy of 40 trucks was moving in daylight when someone shouted a warning. 2 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters came in low from the east, their cannons already firing. Davis had perhaps 3 seconds to react. He jerked his wheel right, sending his truck into a ditch. All along the convoy, other drivers did the same. The German fighters roared overhead, their cannon shells tearing through canvas and steel. One truck exploded, its cargo of fuel drums igniting. Another simply disintegrated, hit squarely by multiple shells. Then the fighters were gone, climbing away, before American anti-aircraft guns could engage. The attack had lasted perhaps 30 seconds. In that time, 3 trucks were destroyed, 5 damaged, and 7 drivers killed. But within an hour, the damaged trucks had been stripped of usable parts, their cargo transferred, and the convoy reformed and continued east. The Germans had inflicted casualties, but not delay. The Red Ball kept moving. The greatest enemy, the Red Ball Express, faced was not the Germans, but exhaustion. Human beings have physical limits. The Red Ball demanded that drivers exceed those limits day after day. Sleep deprivation became so severe that drivers hallucinated. Men reported seeing people who were not there, hearing voices giving them orders, experiencing brief moments where they lost all sense of where they were or what they were doing. Medical officers recognized the problem but had no solution. The front needed supplies. There were not enough drivers. Every man who stopped to rest meant trucks sat idle instead of delivering cargo. So the drivers kept going, pushed past exhaustion into a state where their bodies operated on instinct while their minds barely functioned. Private Elijah Carter of the 485th Quartermaster Service Company fell asleep at the wheel on September 21st. His truck, carrying 4 tons of canned rations, drifted off the road and overturned in a field. Carter survived with only bruises. An autopsy might have shown nothing wrong, but doctors who examined him noted extreme fatigue, elevated heart rate, signs of chronic stress. He had been driving for 28 consecutive days, averaging 16 hours per day behind the wheel. Carter was ordered to rest for 48 hours. He refused. "The boys at the front don't get days off," he told the medical officer. "I got no right to one either." He was back driving within 24 hours. 11 days later, on October 2nd, Carter suffered a massive heart attack while driving. His truck left the road and crashed. This time, there was no survival. He was 25 years old. The official records would list Carter's cause of death as natural causes, a heart attack. But every Red Bull driver who heard the story understood the truth. Elijah Carter had been killed by the Red Bull Express as surely as if a German bullet had found him. He had simply worn himself out in service of an operation that consumed men as readily as it consumed trucks and tires and gasoline. By mid-September, the Red Bull Express had grown beyond anything its creators had imagined. The original 67 truck companies had expanded to 132. Nearly 6,000 vehicles moved along the route simultaneously. The convoys stretched for hundreds of kilometers, an endless river of steel and canvas flowing from Normandy toward Germany. At its peak, on August 29th, the Red Bull delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies in a single day. That figure represented not just material, but an organizational achievement of staggering complexity. Each ton had to be loaded at Normandy ports, assigned to a specific truck, transported nearly 300 kilometers, unloaded at forward depots, and documented, so Army supply officers knew what had arrived. The entire process occurred under wartime conditions, with minimal staff using vehicles that were breaking down constantly. The system worked because of people like Sergeant Robert Williams, a dispatcher at the Chartres depot. Williams managed traffic for up to 900 trucks per day. His job was to prevent bottlenecks that would slow the entire operation. When trucks arrived faster than they could be unloaded, Williams redirected them to alternate depots. When one route became congested, he sent convoys via different roads. When supplies for a specific unit became urgent, he flagged those trucks for priority handling. Williams worked 18-hour days, standing at a map table, tracking hundreds of vehicles simultaneously. He made decisions constantly, usually with incomplete information, knowing that every error meant delays that could affect operations at the front. He went 2 weeks without a full night's sleep. His subordinates found him several times unconscious at his desk, having literally worked until he collapsed. On September 15th, Williams correctly predicted that a bridge on the main route to Chartres was about to fail from overuse. He redirected all traffic to an alternate route hours before the bridge collapsed under the weight of a fully loaded convoy. That decision saved perhaps 40 trucks and prevented a traffic jam that would have delayed supplies for an entire day. Williams received no medal, no official recognition. He simply continued working until the Red Bull ended in November. For the French population, the Red Bull Express became a daily reminder that liberation was real and irreversible. Towns that had lived under German occupation for 4 years now watched American trucks roar through their streets day and night. The noise was constant, overwhelming. The roads, never designed for such traffic, crumbled under the weight. But after years of German military convoys heading west to reinforce the occupation, the sight of American trucks heading east toward Germany was profoundly reassuring. French civilians helped however they could. When trucks broke down far from maintenance stations, farmers arrived with horses to tow them to safety. Women brought food and water to drivers during brief stops. Children collected spent brass casings and bits of metal as souvenirs, clearing debris from the roads in the process. The mayor of Chartres, a town that saw more Red Bull traffic than any other in France, organized his entire population to support the operation. French engineers repaired roads overnight. French carpenters built wooden platforms for faster loading and unloading. French mechanics, trained in pre-war times, helped maintain American trucks using improvised tools and scavenged parts. There was romance too, inevitable. When young soldiers moved through liberated towns, African-American drivers, many experiencing for the first time in their lives treatment as equals rather than inferiors, found French women remarkably welcoming. Relationships formed that scandalized both French traditionalists and American segregationists. These romances would create complications after the war, when mixed-race children, born of Red Bull encounters, faced discrimination in both France and America. But in September 1944, love seemed simpler. A moment of human connection in the chaos of war, the contrast between French acceptance and American segregation was not lost on Red Bull drivers. Private Washington Rector of the 39 16th Quartermaster Truck Company summarized the bitter irony succinctly. In France, I could walk into any cafe and be served. I could talk to any woman without fear. But in my own country, there were restaurants that would not serve me, pools I could not swim in, schools my children could not attend. We were good enough to die for America, but not good enough to live as equals in America. The segregation within the Red Ball itself created dangerous situations. On September 18th, an African-American convoy attempted to pass a slower convoy of white drivers. What should have been a simple overtaking maneuver became a contest of wills. The white drivers swerved their trucks to block the road. The black drivers tried to pass anyway. For several terrifying minutes, vehicles weighing 5 tons apiece played chicken at high speed on a narrow French road. The confrontation ended without collision, only because a military police jeep arrived and threatened both groups with court-martial. But the incident revealed the absurdity and danger of maintaining racial divisions during wartime operations. Men who should have been united in common purpose were instead divided by a system of prejudice that served no military function and actively endangered the mission. Yet, even within this segregated system, bonds formed. White officers who initially shared the Army's racist attitudes found their beliefs challenged by experience. Corporal John Miller, a white driver from Iowa, wrote in his diary about the transformation he witnessed in himself and others. "I was raised to believe that colored men were lazy and unreliable." Miller wrote on September 30th, "The Army taught me that they were suited only for manual labor, not for positions requiring judgment or courage. But 3 months on the Red Ball has shown me the truth." Private Thomas Johnson kept driving with shrapnel lodged in his shoulder, refusing to stop until his load was delivered. Sergeant Robert Williams pulled me from a burning cab at risk to his own life. These men are better soldiers than I am, and I am ashamed of the prejudice I brought with me to France. Ernst Miller would become, after the war, one of the first white activists for civil rights in Iowa. His transformation was not unique. Thousands of American soldiers, both white and black, learned during the Red Ball that shared sacrifice created bonds stronger than the racial divisions their country maintained. By October, the Red Ball Express was showing strain everywhere. Drivers were approaching complete exhaustion. Trucks were failing at catastrophic rates. The routes themselves, never designed for such heavy traffic, had deteriorated into obstacle courses of potholes and broken pavement. Over 40,000 tires had been destroyed. Maintenance facilities were overwhelmed with work. Supply depots were running out of spare parts. Most critically, the distances had become untenable. As Allied armies advanced deeper into France, the Red Ball routes lengthened. By early October, some trucks were traveling over 400 kilometers one way. At those distances, the trucks consumed substantial fuel themselves, reducing the net delivery of gasoline to the front. The system approached the point where it consumed more resources than it delivered. German intelligence finally understood what the Americans had achieved. A report dated October 5th from Field Marshal Model's headquarters described the Red Ball with something approaching disbelief. The Americans operate approximately 6,000 trucks in continuous rotation, delivering up to 12,000 tons of supplies per day. This exceeds the capacity of most European rail systems and is accomplished entirely by road transport. The drivers appear to operate without rest, the vehicles without proper maintenance. By every rational measure, this system should have collapsed within days, yet it continues to function and expand. Model himself added a handwritten note to the report. "This is not logistics as we understand it. This is industrial brute force applied to a military problem. The Americans do not optimize. They overwhelm, and we have no counter to this approach." The Field Marshal was correct. German military science, refined over centuries of European warfare, emphasized efficiency and optimization. German logistics aimed to deliver exactly what was needed, exactly when needed, with minimal waste. It was an elegant system when it worked, but it broke down when the careful calculations proved wrong or when circumstances changed faster than plans could adapt. American logistics, as demonstrated by the Red Ball Express, operated on different principles entirely. The Americans accepted waste, inefficiency, even chaos, as acceptable costs if the result was keeping their armies supplied. They did not optimize the system. They simply threw more trucks, more drivers, more resources at the problem until it was solved through sheer, overwhelming force. This philosophical difference reflected deeper cultural contrasts. German military thinking valued precision and discipline. American industrial culture valued results regardless of methods. The Germans sought to win through superior planning and execution. The Americans sought to win by ensuring their soldiers had so much material superiority that tactics became almost secondary. By November, the strategic situation had evolved enough that the Red Ball Express was no longer necessary in its original form. The port of Antwerp in Belgium had been captured and cleared of German demolitions. French railways were being repaired and restored to operation. Portable fuel pipelines were being constructed to deliver gasoline directly from ports to forward areas. The emergency that had created the Red Ball had passed. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended operations. In 82 days, it had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies. 23,000 drivers had moved more cargo in less time than most military planners thought possible. The cost had been measured in destroyed vehicles, exhausted men, and casualties that would never appear in battle reports but were no less real. The final statistics told part of the story, but not all of it. The Red Ball had delivered supplies. Yes, but it had also demonstrated something more important. It had shown that American logistics could adapt faster and operate at larger scale than any military force in history. It had proven that African American soldiers, given responsibility and opportunity, performed as well as any troops in any army. It had revealed that the United States possessed not just industrial capacity, but the organizational skill to employ that capacity effectively under the worst conditions imaginable. Years later, Eisenhower championed the interstate highway system, directly inspired by what he witnessed in France. The Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies in 82 days. But its true achievement was something the German generals never anticipated. It proved that logistics could decide wars as decisively as any battle, that determination mattered more than doctrine, that men dismissed as inferior could perform at the highest levels when given the chance. For the German Wehrmacht, watching those endless convoys proved their calculations had been catastrophically wrong. They had underestimated not American industrial capacity, but American willingness to abandon conventional thinking entirely. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's final assessment was brutally honest. We lost, not on the battlefield, but on the roads of France. We could destroy their tanks. We could not stop their trucks. The Red Ball drivers returned home without parades or medals. Many faced the same discrimination they had left, but they carried with them an unanswerable argument. They had been essential to victory. That knowledge would fuel the civil rights movement that finally dismantled the segregation they had fought under. The trucks are gone, the roads rebuilt. But the lesson remains: never underestimate those you dismiss. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.